Good afternoon from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome to the panel Cross-Regional Conversation on the Roles of Civil Society Working for Disarmament for the second day of the International Civil Society Forum to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in Tokyo. So I am aware there are many attractive events happening in the same time slot, and I appreciate your interest in coming to this event. And we will make our utmost effort to make this session as interesting as possible. My name is Shizuka KURAMITSU. I am working as a research assistant at Washington, D.C.-based civil society organization called the Arms Control Association. I will be moderating this panel for today. And the purpose of this session today is to hear from senior civil society leaders from across the regions, namely Japan, South Korea, Germany, and the United States, about recent nuclear weapons-related issues in the region and about how civil society organizations can produce more effective outcomes towards a world without nuclear weapons. With that, allow me to remind that this session will be recorded and be public later. For those who are joining us online, please feel free to use this Q&A function on Zoom. And now let me introduce our panelists, but as the time is quite limited, we have 4 panelists today. So I would like to maximize time to hear from them, and please forgive me for a very brief introduction. So first on your screen, you see Oliver MEIER, who is a policy and research director at London and Berlin-based think tank, European Leadership Network. Oliver, thank you for joining us online from Berlin in the very early morning on Sunday, and we are excited to hear and learn from you. Second, it is my pleasure to have Akira KAWASAKI, an executive committee, a member of the Japanese NGO Peace Boat. Third, please welcome Ms. Youngah, manager of Center for Peace and Disarmament at the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, based in South Korea. Lastly, but not least, let me introduce Daryl KIMBALL, an executive director of the Washington, D.C.-based think tank and Arms Control Association. As to the flow of the panel, I will ask each panelist to address 3 things in their first remarks for about, I hope it will be about 5 to 7 minutes, but I know I asked a lot of the questions, so please don't feel too pressure to answer all of them. And after everyone spoke, I hope to have second round of the questions and plan to open the floor for the Q&A session around 5 p.m. in Japan time. So 3 questions I would like to ask every panelist for now is, first, what are the top nuclear weapons related issues in your region, country today? And second, please give us a summary of the current approach and a strategy that your organizations is taking in the region or country to advance disarmament. And thirdly, a summary of overview of how your organization and network engages with public and governments or collaborate with the rest of the civil society community. So let me now turn to Oliver on a screen first. Oliver, you have a floor.
Good morning. Good morning from Berlin. I hope this is working and that you can hear me. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues on the panel and on the screen, actually, and on the program. Wish I could be there with you, and congratulations to the organizers for pulling this very impressive meeting together at the beginning of what will be an important year for all of us, for nuclear disarmament. Many challenges ahead of us, but I think also many opportunities to take nuclear disarmament forward, including meeting of states parties of the TPNW and preparations for the NPT review conference. Let me try to answer the 3 questions very briefly. and start out by giving you my top 3 issues on the nuclear arms control disarmament agenda from somebody who works in Berlin in a Europe-wide organization. Clearly, the number 1 issue is Russia's nuclear threats in the context of its war against Ukraine. These nuclear threats, explicit and reckless and issued in conjunction with the attack on another state, a non-nuclear weapon states, have certainly increased awareness around risks associated with nuclear weapons. In the eyes of many, there are indications that nuclear weapons are still useful, but I think it's upon us to show that nuclear weapons are part of the problem, not the solution to the challenges we are faced with, even in conflicts with leaders like Vladimir Putin. The number 2 issue is Iran for us sitting in Europe. The risk that Iran may acquire nuclear weapons in the near future. Europeans are hoping to avert that scenario through diplomacy, but they're also preparing for it. This is going to become more important as we're approaching a crucial deadline in the fall. There's a threat of this snapback of sanctions, and Iran has threatened to withdraw from the NPT. And I think it will be important for us in the disarmament community to point out that military strikes against Iran's nuclear facility are not only illegal, but would also be counterproductive from a non-proliferation standpoint. The number 3 issue is discussions around NATO's deterrence posture. You may recall that Germany and the United States in the summer last year decided to deploy new intermediate range conventional missiles in Germany starting next year. This decision brought back many echoes of the early 1980s when many of us, including myself, protested the deployment of Pershing II and cruise missiles in Germany and other countries. I think one of the things we can make arguments on is that we need to increase the distance, the gap between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. This relates to issues like nuclear no first use posture, or at least a so-called sole purpose posture. Donald Trump has returned to the White House. That will no doubt increase the profile of nuclear threats again in the future. We've seen that during the first time he was in the White House. We saw at the time debates around German nuclear weapons, European nuclear weapons. Should we acquire those? I'm afraid those debates will return, and we have to prepare for those. Let me turn to the second question very briefly and summarize the current approach that the European leadership has taken on these issues. We are not a clear-cut disarmament organization, to be frank. In the early days, the ELN was the European Leadership Network for Nuclear Disarmament, but we've broadened our remit. We work on nuclear disarmament, but our focus is on preventing the risk of existential conflict in Europe, and that means the risk of nuclear war. We do that through research on Russia-West relations, on emerging disruptive technologies, and on strengthening international agreements, including the NPT. We also do that through our networks, which brings together about 450 current, past, and future decision makers and experts, and engaging with governments. We are a network, as the name suggests, a network of networks, actually. And I think this network-based work is increasingly important in an international environment. We are one of the few organizations that has among its network members also experts and senior experts from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. We engage across the divide, including with Russian colleagues, to the degree that we still can. We try to keep channels of communication open, and that is something that will remain important, particularly because European and Asian security is interconnected. And my last remark here is that we work with other organizations in other regions. I see Akira-san from who's also associated with APLN, the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, and we do a lot of work with colleagues in APLN, which I think will be increasingly important. So let me maybe stop there, and thank you again for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. It was very brief and very comprehensive. So now turn to Akira.
はい、ありがとうございます。日本語で話をしますので、イヤホン
Thank you
つけ
very
てもらえれば
much.
と
I
思いま
will
すけども、
be
日
speaking
本で
in
の課題や取り
Japanese,
組
so
みという
English
ことを、
interpretation will
特
be
に短
provided
く
simultaneously.
言おうと
I
思い
would
ます
like
と
to
難
speak
しい
very
んですが、
briefly.
日
Well, it's hard
本
to
の場合
put
はで
this
すね、
situation
やは
in
り
very
広
brief
島と
words,
長
but in the
崎
case
の
of Japan, we of
経
course
験があり
have
ますの
the
で、
experience of
いわゆる
Hiroshima
反
and
核運動という
Nagasaki.
のは
So the
1950
anti-nuclear
年代
movement
から
here since the
長く続いておりま
1950s
して、
has
そして
continued
本
for
当にた
many
くさんの
decades, and there are
日
many
本の
different
NGO 平和団体が
NGOs, peace
核兵器廃
organizations,
絶と
and other
いう取
groups
り
who have
組み
been
を
working
続けて
towards
き
nuclear
たわ
weapons
けであります。
abolition here in
そうし
Japan
た
through
中で
this
ですね、
period. Within such circumstances,
これは2000
this
年代
is
に
something that when
入
we
ってか
enter
ら
the
というふうに言えると思います
2000s,
けれど
I
も、
think it could be said,
多くの
many
NGO が相互
different
協力をして
NGOs started to cooperate
連携をしていこ
together
うとい
and
う
have
機
more
運が高まりまして、
coordinated efforts. And there's more and more momentum for this
2010年
since
からです
then.
ね、
And from the year
核兵器廃絶日
2010,
本
we
NGO 連絡
created the
会ということ
Japan
で、
NGO Network for Nuclear
さまざ
Weapons
まな
Abolition, bringing
NGO が
together many
連
different
絡組織を
organizations
作りまして、
as a kind of liaison
協
unit
力
for
して活動する
coordination,
ように
sharing of
なってまいりま
information,
した。
looking at how to
で
enhance more
その連絡
cooperation
会
amongst
という
civil
ものが実は
society.
今回の
And
この
then
フォーラム
that
を主催して
NGO
おります
network is what
核
led
兵
to
器
the
なき日
creation
本
of
キ
the
ャンペーン
Japan
の母体
campaign
に
to
なっており
abolish
ます。
nuclear weapons, which is
で
the
この連
organizer
絡
of
会
this forum.
参加し
So
てい
the
る団体は様
NGO
々
network,
で
there are
ど
many
んな
different
テーマに
organizations
取り組むべきかと
participating. So we
いうことは
discussed
いろいろ意
together
見
what the
が異なるん
priority
ですけれ
issues
ど
that we
も、
should be working on. Of
4
course,
つ
there's
の
differences in
ところ
opinions
に
throughout that, but
絞っ
there are
て
four
協力を
particular
していこうという
parts
ことをその
which
2010
we
年の
have
時から言
decided
っておりま
since
し
the
て、
year
それは今日まで
2010
継
to
続を
work
しております。
together, and they have continued
一つ
through
は
until
核
this
兵器
day.
禁止条約。
One of these is
こ
the
れを
Treaty on the
2010年の
Prohibition
時はまだ
of
できてい
Nuclear
ません
Weapons.
でしたの
In
で、
2010, of
これ
course, the
を
treaty
な
didn't
るべく早
exist
く
yet,
作ること。
so it
そ
was
して
looking at
今で
how to
は
create
その
such a
核兵器
treaty.
禁止条約に
And
日
then
本
now
が
the
入るというのが
TPNW
一つです
has
ね。
been created, so now we're
で、
looking at
2つ目と
ensuring
し
that
て、
Japan will
そ
join
れ
the
がすぐ
treaty.
には達成
The
しない
second
とす
point,
るな
while
ら
this may
ば、
not be
日本
achievable
が依存
immediately,
している
looking
核
at
兵器へ
how
の
we
役割
can
ですよね。
reduce the
を
role
縮小して
of
役割を
nuclear
下げて、
weapons
それ
in
が
Japan's
核兵器
security
の再
policy.
生と
So
使
this is,
用
for
というこ
example,
と
looking at issues of
を
no first
いまだ
use,
に日本政府
where
は
even the
先制
Japanese
不使用
government
も
is
嫌だというふうに
still
言っているので、
actually
これを
opposing
やって
no
おります
first use from, the US, for
で、3
example.
点
So
目に
this
で
is the
すね、
second point.
地
The
域の
third
非核化
priority
という
issue
こと
is
で、
looking at
北東ア
regional
ジアの非核兵器地
denuclearization.
帯
So
を作っ
looking
ていく
at
こ
how
と。
to create a
これも
Northeast
共通
Asia
の
nuclear
項目に
weapons
なり
free
ます。
zone as
そして
another
4点目
common
に、
priority. And the fourth
原子力との
has
関係
been
になりますけど
looking
も、
at, this is in relation to
プルトニウ
nuclear
ムの生産
energy
ですね。
and looking at the
これを
production of
原子力
plutonium
政策の一
here
環とし
in
て、
Japan.
プルトニウ
This
ムを
is something
作る
which
と
is
い
being
うこ
done
と
under the
を今
name
やって
of
いますけど
Japan's
も、これ
nuclear
は
energy
核
policy.
兵器の拡散に
However,
つなが
this
りますの
is,
で、
of course,
で
something
これ
which
をや
has
めないと。
linkages
この
to
4点は
proliferation
共
of
通項
nuclear
目とし
weapons.
て
So
やっ
these are
て
the
ま
four
いり
points
ま
which
し
have been
て、
agreed upon
今
as
でも
common
それが重要
priorities
課
by
題
the
というふう
Japan
に状況
NGO
として
network, and
は
we
なっている
continue
と
to
思いま
share
す。
these as our
で、
common
その上でですね、
agenda.
こ
And on top
の
of
核
that,
兵器
we
を
are
なく
then
す日本
looking
キャン
at,
ペーン
as
が
the Japan
昨年
campaign
正
to
式に
abolish
発
nuclear
足をして、
weapons was
で
officially
今回のよう
launched
な
as
大
an
きな国際
organization
会議を
last
開く
year.
のは
And
初
we've
めて
been
なん
able
ですけれど
to, well,
も、
this is our first time to
こ
hold
こ
a
では
forum such as the one this weekend.
核兵器禁止条約
But
に日本が
within the
参加するということを
TPNW and looking at how we can encourage the
それを
Japan to
もう中心
participate
的に
this,
取り組
well,
もうと
that's
いうキャン
really
ペ
the
ーンとしてやってお
focus
りまし
of the
て、
campaign.
そ
So
の
the
第
focus is
一歩
very much
ということ
targeted
で、
on that. And so
ま
we
ず
see
は
this
オブ
forum
ザー
as a
バー参加
first
からし
step,
てくれ
looking
と
at how we
いう
can,
ことでキャンペーンを
at the
ずっと
beginning at
力を入
least,
れて
have
お
Japan join as an observer to the MSP. And this is, we are focusing at the moment, looking at, we see this as a very important political issue. I'm sure you're all seeing this in the headlines in the newspaper. And I think that our NGO corporation has really brought that into reality, brought this level of public and media attention. And as a method towards doing this, Well, we have many different organizations involved. So, of course, there's many political parties here in Japan. So looking at how we can bring them together in a multi-partisan or non-partisan way. There are some organizations which have particular affiliations or relationships with political parties. So if we can have collaboration across the board within civil society, within NGOs, this is a way to also have impact on each of the political parties. And I think this is an example of a success of Japanese civil society recently. Every year, we now have an annual roundtable with representatives from each of the major Japanese political parties on an annual basis to call, from our perspective, for Japan's observer participation in the MSP, and where now we have been able to reach the point where almost all of the political parties are in support of Japan's observer participation. So this is the example I would share.
Thank you. So let me turn to Youngah now.
Yeah, as you already know well, the Korean Peninsula is a region where the threat of a nuclear war is ever present, and the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula has been ongoing for more than 20 years. And the risk of a nuclear war on the peninsula and in Northeast Asia has been raised as a nuclear arms race has intensified recently. Since 2019, when dialogue and negotiation were suspended, the DPRK nuclear and missile capabilities have been advanced, and the ROK and US have also conducted military exercise using nuclear forces and reorganized into a nuclear-based alliance on the ground of the DPRK nuclear threat. And the trilateral military cooperation between ROK, US, and Japan is developing the level of military alliance. Both the ROK-US alliance and the DPRK are developing military strategies that rely competitively on the nuclear weapons. So the biggest problem is that the military exercise with a nuclear war in mind are currently being conducted competitively on the peninsula. In this process, the goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is becoming increasingly distant and virtually disappearing from the goal. After the Washington Declaration, the Yoon administration released a national security strategy. Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was replaced by denuclearization of the DPRK. The message of the ROK and US on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the establishment of peace have also changed. Implementing the DPRK-US agreement and establishing the permanent peace gradually disappeared. And denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was replaced by the denuclearization of the DPRK, following the ROK-US-Japan summit in August 2023. The change in the terminology, which was adopted by US and Japan, signals a focus on deterrence rather than negotiation with the DPRK. The goal of eliminating the nuclear threats on the Korean Peninsula is being de-emphasized in favor of the goal of strengthening a U.S. military posture that rely on nuclear weapons. Paradoxically, the DPRK nuclear position is becoming a fact as a nuclear-based alliance are emphasized. South Korean civil society has been advocating a peace-first approach is needed to change the current situation of anxiety. Since the peace process on the Korean Peninsula has stopped, the peace by strength pursued by countries concerned has failed, and the approach of pressuring the other to succumb to force has only increased the distrust and worsened the situation. The peace-first approach is to end the Korean War, resolve issues through dialogue and cooperation instead of sanctions and pressure, build trust through improved relations, reduce military spending, and revise aggressive military strategies, eliminate all nuclear threats on the Korean Peninsula. The peace process on the Korean Peninsula should be paralleled with the peace cooperation in Asia-Pacific region. We believe that stopping hostility and ending the war is a most fundamental solution to creating peaceful Korean Peninsula free of nuclear weapons. It is necessary to end the unstable ceasefire regime, dissolve the hostile relationship, and transition to normalize the diplomatic relation, build mutual trust, and eliminate the military threats. It is the first way to achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and peace in East Asia. And it is the way to prevent the nuclear proliferation and advance the nuclear disarmament. In 2020, the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War, South Korean civil society and religious groups been working for peace on the Korean Peninsula, joined together with the goal in mind and the Korean War now. We launched the Korea Peace Appeal campaign to end the Korean War and began the signature campaign to sign the Korea Peace Appeal. Korea Peace Appeal includes the peace first approach, the contents. So the more than 200,000 people from the nearly every country in the world have signed it online and offline. Through the dedicated efforts of the organization, the campaign achieved the various results and concluded in September 2023 with these signatures. We delivered the United Nations and the countries related to the Korean War. The campaign raised the awareness of the unresolved Korean War and widely amplified the voices that improving hostile relations and making a peace treaty are a fundamental solution. Resolve the conflicts on the Korean Peninsula. And I would like to introduce one more thing, that the PSPD is participating in the Ulaanbaatar process of the Global Partnership for Prevention Armed Conflict Northeast Asia, which is secretariat by the Peace Board. The Ulaanbaatar process is a multilateral civil society dialogue in Northeast Asia. Was launched in 2015 with the aim of strengthening dialogue among civil societies in the region to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. In the face of rising the military tensions in East Asia, but the absence of institutional framework for the peace and stability, the purpose of this dialogue is to promote the peace on the Korean Peninsula and denuclearization of Northeast Asia through the Ulaanbaatar process, and to increase the participation and role of women and civil society in achieving these goals. This dialogue has been held every year despite the rising the military tensions on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and is a rare space to participate South and North Korea civil society together to discuss peace issues on the Korean Peninsula. Yes, I think she's focusing on me. So
amazingly, everyone keeps quite track on time. So let me turn to Daryl now.
Well, thank you, Shizuka. It's good to see everyone. Thank you for being here. The Arms Control Association is, of course, based in the United States, but we work internationally. But I'm going to try to describe what the top issues of concern are for nuclear disarmament-oriented organizations in the United States, to talk a little bit about what the Arms Control Association does in that context. But first, let me just say, for years and years in the United States, we, of course, have had a wide range of organizations at the grassroots and the national level, different nuclear weapons expert communities that embrace a range of views. There are some who believe that nuclear deterrence and nuclear arms control are compatible. There are some who believe that nuclear deterrence is dangerous and unsustainable, and that we must advance nuclear disarmament diplomacy. And those of us who, like the Arms Control Association, advocate for nuclear disarmament and against a perpetual policy of nuclear deterrence have always struggled to arrive at a common set of messages and a common campaign objectives to move the US in the direction of nuclear disarmament. Historically, when we've been able to come together on a major common and focused objective, like ending nuclear weapons testing or ratifying a treaty like the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which happened in 2010, we can and have succeeded. But today, circumstances are difficult. We've gone more than a decade without a major debate in the US on a single nuclear weapons issue that's captured the national attention. Presidential leadership has been lacking. But today, as the global nuclear situation has become more difficult, as relations between the US and Russia have worsened, and the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine has reminded the world about the threat of nuclear weapons, and we have Congress and the Trump administration thinking about expanding the US arsenal. We have a focusing of attention by United States civil society organizations working on disarmament on some very focused objectives. And I think we can make progress over the next several years in these areas. So what I'm speaking about is very recently, the Arms Control Association helped organize with the Nuclear Threat Initiative a nuclear disarmament campaign or strategy retreat. We brought together 28 organizations, 50 people to discuss where do we stand after the election of Donald Trump? What can we do in this more difficult context? And we agreed that we needed to work more collaboratively, that we must try to expand our efforts to do more effective work, better outreach with the public, the media, and with not just Democratic, but also Republican policymakers. And we agreed that there were 4 main objectives that we need to be looking at over the next 2 to 3 years. Number 1, encouraging support for a resumption of talks between the White House and the Kremlin on a new nuclear arms control framework before, ideally, New START expires in 1 year, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Second, we are focused on blocking any possible moves to resume US nuclear testing, including efforts to shorten the time that it would take the US to resume testing, which is what we're expecting from the new Trump administration. Third, we're very focused, as Oliver and his European colleagues are, on pushing back against Russian nuclear threats or any other threats of nuclear use, and highlighting the consequences of nuclear war and building opposition to nuclear use or threats of use. And fourth, we're focused on, and this is going to be a fight waged with Congress, in Congress, blocking any decisions to fund or to expand the size of the US arsenal beyond current force levels by making the case that more nuclear weapons do not make us safer. They lead to arms racing and instability and make nuclear weapons reductions harder to achieve. So those are the 4 main priorities that over 24 organizations have agreed should be the focus in the United States for quite a while. I would add that there are separate coalitions and networks of organizations that continue to work to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons through smart diplomacy, and to prevent a war or attacks against Iran to block its destroy its nuclear program. There's also an ongoing effort, though it is not as active as it was a decade ago, to encourage U.S. dialogue with North Korea on denuclearization and peace in the Korean Peninsula. And finally, there's also a related campaign that many of us are supporting to address the ongoing health challenges faced by American downwinders, those affected by U.S. atmospheric nuclear testing, by extending and expanding a program called the Radiation Effects Compensation Act, which provides medical monitoring and limited financial assistance for a certain number of people who have been designated as affected by fallout from nuclear testing. So those are some of the main priorities. The Arms Control Association is a medium-sized organization. We have just 11 full-time staff people. We have a very, I would say, prestigious and active board, but we are a medium-sized think tank, policy advocacy organization. We do networking and organizing, significant public education and media outreach. Those are the ingredients of our activities. And of course, we publish the journal Arms Control Today, the monthly journal Arms Control Today. Comes out 10 times a year. It's a major aspect of our work. And we see that also as an important platform for colleagues in the field to provide ideas and analysis on key issues that are of concern to many people around the world. And we're trying to provide fact-based news reporting on these developments through Arms Control Today, through the news section of the magazine. So Arms Control Today provides us with a unique tool that many other organizations don't have. The last thing I would just end on is to note that in the United States, as I said, it is difficult to bring organizations together around a common set of goals and priorities. And I think one of the lessons I can share with those of you who are working in Japan and elsewhere is that when organizations recognize that we're all working together against an enormous set of challenges, we need to work together, collaboratively, cooperatively, not in competition. We need to complement what one another brings to the table. No one organization has all the capabilities to change government policy on these massive issues which have troubled the globe for decades. So that's one thing we need to think about as we carry out our work. And I'll stop there, Shizuka, and we'll move to the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really fascinating to hear all the landscape of nuclear weapons related issues in each country and each region. It's very different, but it is really interesting to see how each organization are tackling with these issues. At the same time, I was going to ask follow-up question on the challenges part, but I think I feel a little bit doomed. And I think I will turn my question to more uplifting one. Before I open the floor to the questions, I would like to follow up with maybe one or two. I was going to follow up on that challenges one, but I will shift to, since there are some young people in this room as well, and including myself, I would like to ask, in your experiences, what is the example of the successful civil society effort to shift nuclear policy? I think this is a very important question amid a very difficult situation right now. So if I may, I would like to get the reverse order for answering this question. So starting from Daryl, Youngah, Akira, and followed by Oliver, please.
Well, I think it is important to focus on successes and to think about what produced those successes. So what I would mention as part of my career, which is getting longer by the day, I began working in this when I was in my mid-20s. I arrived in Washington in 1989, which was a very propitious time in the field of nuclear disarmament. The Cold War was ending. And I was fortunate to be part of the ending phase of the decades-long campaign to end nuclear testing. If you recall, in 1989-90, the people of Kazakhstan were pushing the Soviet government to end nuclear testing in Kazakhstan. There was something that emerged there, the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement. The Kazakhs took inspiration from Americans who had been lobbying to end nuclear testing. That led the Soviets to halt nuclear testing for a year. In response, in the summer and fall of 1991, a member of Congress, first-year member of Congress, introduced a bill for a U.S. nuclear testing halt for 1 year to match the Soviet halt. So many of us who've been working on the nuclear testing issue focused on this. And this became the singular focus of many disarmament organizations at the time. And we succeeded after a year and a half long campaign to build bipartisan support for this legislation. It overcame the opposition of then President H.W. Bush. The legislation that eventually passed it mandated a 1-year moratorium on U.S. nuclear testing, which meant that Bill Clinton, the incoming president, had to decide, do I extend the moratorium or do I resume nuclear testing? And so there was a very important period in the spring of 1993. We had a strategy meeting that spring, bringing together almost every organization that ever worked on to end nuclear testing. We decided we needed to push the administration to extend the moratorium. There was help from leaders in the new administration, including the first African-American Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, who, when asked the question, do we need to resume nuclear testing? She said to the lab directors, well, why do we need to resume nuclear testing? She challenged their thinking, and it turned the issue around. We had congressional leaders who we were lobbying who challenged the Clinton administration on this issue, and we succeeded in getting Bill Clinton to extend the nuclear test moratorium in July of 1993. And that led to what we all know happened, which was the negotiation of the CTBT, which was concluded in 1996. And even though that treaty has not entered into force because of the peculiar entry into force provision, today, no state is conducting nuclear test explosions. North Korea is the only country that's conducted a nuclear test in the 21st century. So preserving that moratorium, the de facto global moratorium, I think is one of the biggest successes of the global nuclear disarmament movement. And the experience I had in my younger days in Washington, being a part of that, to me is one of the highlights of my career. And it's something that we need to build upon going forward. Thank you.
For me, it's too difficult question. Yeah, the Korean Peninsula is a unique place. The Korean War is not ending, and the DPRK has the nuclear weapons. So many South Korean people think that we need to get more the powerful weapons, and even now the majority of the people, they are support developing our own nuclear weapons. The over 74% of people. But for a long time, the South Korean civil society has been working to amplify the message that the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula can be solved by the ending the war and establishing the peace regime and improving the relations. So even the nuclear war on the war crisis on the Korean Peninsula is escalating now, but I believe that our perspective has spread a bit internationally.
はい、成功例ということでありますけれども、先ほどの
You are asking for the successful example. I said NGO, mutually assisting each other, collaborating, and to have this liaison group more than 50 years. Because of that, if I may take one example of this coalition, for example, signature of the Hibakusha. Hibakusha actually initiated this signatory movement, and many organizations agreed to that, and which actually amounted to the more than 13 million signatures collected over 5 years. That was the process is identical to the period that the adoption of TPNW and actually entry into force. So that also contributed to the raise of the TPNW and gave the pressure for that. And also, bipartisanship was employed for the parliamentarians in Japanese Diet. So there was a much deeper discussion among the parliamentarians. That's probably one of the good examples. And earlier on, the issue for the nuclear disarmament, the one point I missed out was because in Japan, we have hibakusha, the victims of nuclear weapons, more than 100,000 hibakushas here, and what to do with to claim for their rights and how to succeed their testimonies, their sort of will, which is a little bit different from the nuclear disarmament. But last year, at the time of the Nobel Peace Prize awarding ceremony, and you can actually read the speech by Mr. Tanaka at the ceremony, and which depicts how that the hibakusha carried out its activities and also how collaborated with other groups. And of course, the actual compensation is not sufficient. However, little by little, they actually succeeded in getting some kind of compensation from the government.
Yeah, thank you. My internet is a bit shaky. If I am interrupted, do let me know. Let me maybe make 3 short remarks and 3 examples, very brief, I promise. And the 3 short remarks were triggered by Shizuka's introduction, saying this sounds a bit, like gloomy and depressing. What we heard before, like Daryl, I've been in the field for quite a few years. This is a cycle of discussions that goes up and down over the years, we have to be aware that the logic for nuclear disarmament is sound, and the arguments will come up again and will be received more positively at some point in the future, hopefully not too distant future. Because what's the alternative? If we think about the alternative to nuclear disarmament, it's a nuclear arms race that's going to get more complicated, more risky, and the risks of nuclear weapons use will only increase. So I think for us, one of the solutions is to go back to basics here, and make the basic argument about why we need to move in the direction of nuclear disarmament, and remind people of the basic arguments that we have. We also, I think, have to be realistic, because you asked about where we have been successful in shifting policy. Daryl gave some good examples, but quite often it's not so much about actually shifting policies, but changing the debate about some of these issues and injecting our arguments in the debate. That I think is an appropriate yardstick for success. Also, I say that also because we shouldn't frustrate ourselves by setting ambitions too high. So let me give you 3 examples from the not too distant future, where I think we have been, against this kind of yardstick, relatively successful in Germany and in Europe. During the first Trump administration, as I mentioned before, we had this debate about German and European nuclear weapons. I think in a concerted effort by people from the field, we have been able, during the first Trump administration, to push that debate to the fringe of the nuclear debate. In the end, nobody from the mainstream seriously advocated for German nuclear weapons. That will be harder second time around, because the Trump administration obviously is more radical, the second Trump administration, than the first one. But that's, I think, where we have been relatively successful. TPNW has been mentioned. Germany also has participated as an observer in the meetings of states parties. I hope it will participate again in the next meeting of states parties. That's been a battle. it's not been easy to make that argument. That was difficult to make, but arguments around the usefulness of constructive engagement, even with a treaty that the German government will not sign in the foreseeable future, have carried the day, and I think that's important. And then I think, this debate we had around the deployment of US conventional missiles in Germany starting next year has been a relative success because it has highlighted the risks of these deployments. It has led to a debate around the risks associated with integrated deterrence, with mixing nuclear and conventional weapons in these kind of warfighting scenarios, and that has been useful. So for me, some of the important things is that we need to be prepared for these kind of debates. Some you can foresee. We have to be persistent in making the same arguments over and over again. We have to connect to other discourses, speak to decision makers, but don't lecture. Try to get into their heads, know your facts. Arms Control Today is a great source. And we must work with the media, which is increasingly difficult because it's become such a polarized debate everywhere. But so are some of the things that, from my perspective, are important. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I would like to now open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have any question, please raise your hand, or for the online audience, feel free to use the chat function.
Thank you for your explanation today. It's very helpful. I have to tribute to your contributions as a former UN officials. I have been able to work with your representative in many occasions for 25 years, and I cannot really thank adequately for how much contribution you have made. And also I'm encouraged by your continued efforts and your vision for the future work. I have one question. When you coordinate at the national level or even regional level of various NGOs, the civil society organization, what kind of challenges have you encountered, and what's the trick or secret to basically coordinate in those groups, particularly given the different interests and approach? And just nuclear disarmament, you have so many different approaches. So I'd like to ask you how you dealt with this problem. I hear the quite difficult problem you have faced. And as a secretariat officials, we often ask you to coordinate among themselves because we can't handle it. Thank you.
Anyone would like to take?
Who were you directing the question at in particular? All of us? Okay. Well, let me just take a brief stab at responding. I mean, the challenge of coordination and collaboration between organizations. I mean, I think the first rule of thumb is that you give agency to the organizations that you're working with. You ask them what they would do, what their priorities are, and you try to identify, well, we have common priorities. Why don't we work on them together? So rather than trying to impose a plan or to impose an idea, we need to recognize that, the strength of our field, of our movement, is the diversity of views, of capabilities, and to recognize that, that provides opportunities to reach more people, to influence more in different policymakers in different countries. So, in the United States, it's been particularly difficult to do this because it's a large country. There are many different institutions, large and small, different leadership. But there, I think, is a there's a core of 2 to 3 dozen organizations that share basic principles about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy, who have through the years worked together and will continue to work together. So I don't know if that helps answer the question. It's an art, it's not a science. And it takes extra energy by a few organizations to bring people together. I mean, the act of coordinating, this Akira, I mean, it takes a great deal of energy and time and talent to engage in that coordinating. And so everyone needs to understand that it takes investment in that type of work to make it happen.
I would like to respond to that question from the perspective of our experience here in Japan. And so doing something together as a result, it will be more successful. And I think if people understand that, they will come together to take that action together. So how do we actually reach that understanding? There's sometimes a bit of a hurdle before you get to that. That's also, of course, on a personal level as well, even as individuals. But as long as you have organizations, of course, you have your own different institutional backgrounds. You want to make sure that your own organization can have successes. You have your different perspectives and so on. And sometimes people feel that if you come together, your organization's presence will be half. If it's 3 organizations, it will become a third. Sometimes people tend to look at it that way. But if we can rather say, if we work together, we can reach better results and faster as well. So sharing that kind of common understanding about the importance of cooperation in order to achieve these common goals and having dialogue towards that is something that we need to put sincere efforts into. On top of that, if we look at examples in other countries, there is, of course, sometimes financial issues. If I'm being very frank, issues of funding. There may be only certain organizations that will provide funding for these kind of work, so there becomes a different competition between different organizations, which can prevent coordination or cooperation as well. So I'm going to say this without being afraid of misunderstanding, but in Japan, we don't really need to worry about that, actually. I've seen examples in a lot of other countries, but Japan actually, in order to, or the different individuals or organizations who are willing to put funding towards nuclear abolition, I think is more perhaps than in other countries, particularly from individual donations and so as well. So if we are able to collaborate together, I think compared to the situation in other countries, we may be in a somewhat better position in terms of not having to worry about competition over funds. And the other thing to point as well is to look at the role of the hibakusha as well. That has been something which has given so much energy and power to civil society as well. The hibakusha standing up, and if they make suggestions, recommendations, no matter your own organization's background, of course, the voice of the hibakusha is still powerful to bring everybody together. In the case of this Japan campaign organizing this forum, we have, of course, Tanaka Terumi as the representative of this campaign. And this is because he, as the leader of the hibakusha, is saying, we need to do this together. But we now have the issue of the advanced age of the hibakusha, and so we need to have face up to new challenges which will be coming in the future when we look at their role as well.
Thank you. Yes, please. Actually, in South Korea, the atmosphere of the abolishment of a nuclear weapon is totally different from Japanese society. Actually, the South Korea on the Korean Peninsula is the country with the second highest country to have the bomb victims in the world, but it is not easy to talk about disarmament or to speak out against the even extended deterrence policies in the ROK. So I mentioned about the recent poll about the nuclear weapons, and the other one is another challenge is that ending the Korean War has the issue of ending the Korean War has become a political issues. So when we collaborate, when we cooperate with the National Assembly, it is too difficult to discuss about these issues. Actually, the Moon
Jane administration, the previous administration, has been pushing for the declaration of the end of the Korean War, but the Conservative Party had made it political issues, political agenda. So after that, the Democratic Party, they has not done anything to do it. The other one is the most challenges is we faced is the people's skepticism. The many people are thinking the Korean Peninsula issues is we cannot solve for the 70 years. So how can we solve the now? So when we conducted the Korea Peace Supply campaign the last for 3 years, when every week we went to the outside and we collected the signatures from the people, but every time people asked us, how can we solve these problems? When the North Korea has the nuclear weapons, how can we end the Korean War? So it is too difficult to amplify the ending the war, the message.
Thank you. Oliver,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Very briefly, good remarks already. Again, three things maybe. The first one, Akira-san already mentioned, and that is the funding side of things. For many of us in the field, that has been an increasingly difficult situation. It's likely to become more difficult as the Trump administration's decision to defund, many of the activities related to our work will just suck, funding out of the field even more. So that's a constant issue, and it impacts our ability to also work with others because the relative share of time we spend for fundraising has been increasing. So that's a consistent issue. The other problem we're having is in these highly polarized debates that we are facing in many of our societies. What's the baseline, something that Daryl referred to? What are the issues we can unite around? In the European Leadership's Network, we have a range of political views and positions represented. For us, there are two baselines, I think, is we do what we can and we support everything that reduces the risks of nuclear weapons use. And you can break that down into a number of issues that are important also on the disarmament agenda, including, some of the things that have been discussed already, extending New START, strengthening the nuclear testing taboo, and keeping lines of communication open. And that's, I think, the second baseline for us, that we do need to keep talking even to people who are on the other side. And that includes for us, for example, Russian colleagues. That is something that not many organizations are still doing, but we do think it's important to keep on speaking to each other, to have that empathy, understanding for what is going on the other side. I think there was a question in the Q&A on, do we need to keep on, and how can we keep on talking to Chinese and North Korean colleagues and counterparts. And I think that's the other bottom line for us. And the third thing that is important for us at the European Leadership Network is to connect the issues. A lot of attention is on climate change and other existential risk. There's a lot of attention on artificial intelligence, which could be another existential risk. Nuclear weapons is certainly in that category. And to connect these issues and the dots and make clear that it's, not only climate change, but the nuclear risks are more immediate. I think also easier to solve in many ways. I think is an argument that we need to make, and that resonates particularly with the younger generation. So that's maybe a third point I briefly wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I would like to ask for the maybe concluding remarks from each. But at the same time, I will also like to exercise my authority as a moderator to add some question if you could touch upon in your remark as well. How could my question I would like you to answer if you could is how can NGOs collaborate across the region? But I am aware each of your organization is not like ICANN that has a global network. So I would like to ask what are your thoughts on collaborating across the regions, and especially given this is for 80th anniversary of the atomic bombing. Yeah. So let me turn this to you, starting from Daryl.
Well, that's a very good question. Well, let me offer the following thoughts about that, and to build on something Oliver just said at the end. The nuclear weapons challenge is, as we all know, a global challenge. And I think, some of the campaigns and examples that we've talked about, if you examine what led to success, it was in part the efforts of campaigners, political leaders, ordinary citizens, scientists in different countries and regions. The example of ending nuclear testing. I mean, this was a global campaign, and it was connections between NGOs that helped lead to, in different countries and regions, that led to success. Oliver just mentioned the vital importance of engaging with our counterparts in Russia and China, in North Korea, to the extent that that's possible, but also within our own countries, with people and institutions that don't share our beliefs and our assumptions about nuclear weapons. We cannot just continue to talk to one another and expect to succeed. So we need to think about, as it's called, track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues. I think that's going to become more important as we go forward into the future. But how to bring together the different organizations around the world that are committed to achieving the abolition of nuclear weapons. I would offer very briefly for consideration an idea that I've been kicking around for quite a while, but haven't been able to act upon. At some point, we may want to consider establishing an informal global nuclear disarmament directors forum, a network of communication between some of the major coalitions and organizations in different countries who are working towards nuclear abolition. Yes, we have ICANN, but ICANN is very focused on the TPNW. And as we just heard from the discussions here, I mean, each of our organizations, whether in networks, whether it's in Europe, Asia, North America, or elsewhere, have a number of other interests in nuclear policy, many common concerns. So perhaps that would be one approach. That would take resources. It would take time to organize, but that's something that we might consider establishing. The 24 to 36 key organizations, their leaders meeting once or twice a year by Zoom or maybe in person at a major conference to share perspectives on what we're doing and where we might have common concerns and where we could collaborate in the future. Thank you.
Kimball said all things that what I want to say. Actually, as Kimball said, the nuclear issues is global issues and all agenda is connected. So a few years ago, I had an opportunity to go advocacy trip to European Union. At that time, the non-governmental organization based in Russia, they helped us to have a meeting with the European Union, the parliament. At that time, the the time the inter-Korea relations and the situation on the Korean Peninsula was worse, and that time the DPRK didn't want to talk with South Korea and the US, so that the only they have the communication channels with the European Union. So I think the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula is connected to peace in Northeast Asia, and the nuclear war crisis is nuclear crisis is in East Asia is connected world. So I think it needs to collaborate more, that we can share the perspectives each other, and that we can learn from each other. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。今日のお話の中で私の方からは、
So from today,
超党派で NGO を協力していくということに
So
よって、
there have been
超
talks
党派
about
の国会議員を一つの議論に巻き込んでいくと。
taking having policies maker come into the conversation.
これを国際的にもですね、
So
広げていくようなことが
also internationally,
あったらいいなというふうに思っておりまして、
I think it will be
今日はアメリカの方、またヨー
good
ロッパの方
to
が来ていらっしゃるわけですが、実は9月に
expand this conversation. So it's good that we have people from all around.
ソウルでの国会の中で
So in the Seoul
小さい会合
Parliament,
でありましたけれども、
there was a small
日本
meeting.
の与党野党の議員、
So
韓国の与党野党の議員が
we
一緒
had
になってですね、
the
朝鮮半島における
Korean
核戦
Parliament
争の
members
廃
and
止
the
と
Japanese Parliament
世界的な
members.
核軍縮の増進に向けてということでで
We
すね、
were
議論
talking
をする
about
会があって、
the
そこには
nuclear
NGO もいましたし、
proliferation.
日韓
There were
両方
also
から与野党の議員が
NGOs
来ていると、そのような
and
ことがあっ
also
たんですね。でそこでこういう
both
のいいねと、続けようって
countries'
話をしま
parliament
したけど
members.
も、それはただ黙ってても続きませんので、やっぱり
So
計画をしていろいろ
we
話し合っ
had
てそうしたこ
to
とを
plan for
進めていく
this,
必要があるでしょうし、
and
同
we
じよう
should
な
probably
議員
have
間の
to
対話っていう
make
のを
similar efforts in the
NGO が
future.
促進して、日
And
米でもあるい
NGOs
は日欧でもですね、日中
should
欧でもですね、
push
やっていく
to
べきだなと
have
いうふうに思いま
similar
す。で、
conversations
そうす
between
る
Japan
こと
and
で、
America, or Japan
政府にいつも頼ってま
and
すとですね、
China again.
じゃあ
But if
アメ
you
リカの
rely
状
on the
況は
government,
どうなってますか、ヨーロッパの状況は、政府が日本政府が説明するということに頼らずに、いや
so
我
we
々
don't
は
want to
直
rely on the
接その
Japanese
国の議員
government
と
telling
連
us
携をして、
how
その政策がどういうふうになってい
how
くかと、
the
そういう議
American
論がある
government
こ
is
とを
doing or
理解で
the
きますよ
Europe
と、
is
そうい
doing.
う自分たちの情報チャンネルを
So
作っていくということが、
it's
これは大きな
important
力に
to
なっていく
build
と
an
いうふうに思っております。
information channel within our own groups.
But you have a floor.
Thank you. Let me maybe make two remarks here, and just say that I agree with everything that has been said, and the suggestions that have been made. A lot of good analysis already has come up in this session. I think one important point here in trying to increase connections between debates in different regions is to make to frame nuclear disarmament as a global commons issue and nuclear weapons as a global commons issue. Quite often in the debate here in Germany and in Europe, considerations that have a global nature and connections to other issues don't come up at all. There have been, many reports written which don't mention the NPT at all, and it seems as if this debate is becoming very Eurocentric, and that I think is very important to make clear that the implications of nuclear weapons use, proliferation risks, these are global commons issues, and they need to be addressed as such, which is, I think, why it's very important that we have this new group being set up in the UN on nuclear weapons effects, which is going to help us to understand the global implications of this issue. There is a debate about the security connections, for example, between Europe and Asia. The war in Ukraine also has involvement of North Korean soldiers, for example. So people understand that the security is connected, but quite often that debate is only limited to deterrence and defense issues. I think we have to inject arguments about arms control and disarmament also, that they apply to both regions equally, that there are substantive connections here, that the technologies that are being used are not limited to one region. I think that offers opportunity also for us to push for global solutions, for global answers, and make clear that nuclear weapons are such an issue. Something that a couple of people have referred to, which I just want to emphasize, it's increasingly important to work with parliamentarians. And a lot of the parliaments have connections to other parliaments in other regions and parts of the world. And to use those opportunities to actually educate and make the case with parliamentarians that disarmament is an issue not to be dropped off the agenda. That's a long-term effort. A lot of knowledge, expertise has been lost, but it's something that I think we must focus on in order to build a sustainable constituency for our arguments also in Parliament across regions. So let me maybe stop there and thank you again for having me. It was a pleasure to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. With that, I would like to close our session. We are a little bit minutes ahead, but it was I hope it was a truly rare opportunity to hear from civil society leaders across the regions, and it is my hope. Oh. Hi, じゃあ、お願いします。Okay, we got another question.
私は、音楽家です。オーケストラのね、トップをずっとやってきて、それでそういう
the music instrument player in the orchestra.
被団協が、
And 被団協
ノーベル平和賞
received the Nobel Peace Prize.
その翌日に
And the next day, I visited Hidankyo office. I really sort of expressed I want to have something in music festival or music concert and in Ako City, Hidankyo. And Mr. Tanaka already has another engagement, but two people, like 20 minutes each to give speech. Then the youth peace ambassadors from Hiroshima, then they have some sort of talk. Then we are going to, that will be followed by music performance. I think in order to abolish nuclear weapons, I think regard this is a very important movement for that. Then having heard yesterday and today, the challenge seems to be so enormous and so difficult. So I want the movement against the nuclear weapons should be more simplified. Probably that's my simplified opinion, but I want more simple, easy to understand narrative. I think you have Chon Myung-hong, who is a world-renowned conductor. I invited him to perform here, and this week there are 3 concerts conducted by him. So, but all the seats are sold out. So I think although it seems so impossible, but nowadays the concerts are so difficult to sell all of the tickets, but that was possible. So this movement looks very difficult, but what we should do to promote this movement.
ちょっとお時間が迫ってきておりますので、the time is quite tight right now, so I would like to encourage you will have a discussion with the panelists after this. And let me close by thanking great panelists today, including Oliver joining from Berlin in the early morning of Sunday. And lastly, allow me to really thank the organizer team and interpreter team for the intensive interpretations, and also volunteers to make this happen. And I cannot wait for the next time. Maybe we can have a meeting, such meeting in Berlin, Seoul, Washington, D.C. Thank you.